Welcome to ANZSOG's 2015 annual conference, Opening Government, Transparency and Engagement in the Information Age. We got off to a great start last night for those of you who were here with the Patterson oration by Anne Sherry. Could I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay the respects to their elders, past and present. Well, we've called the conference Opening Government as opposed to Open Government for a reason. I think everybody can agree that the open government movement that picked up pace from the early 90s, a movement that was about government that listens, that shares information, that informs the public about what it's doing, is a good thing. And indeed, you could say it's the essence of democracy. But despite the agreement about that and the intention in most member governments on doing it better, I think it's fair to say that open government's still an aspiration, a goal rather than reality. We see in a number of jurisdictions citizens still being left out of deliberations about policies and programs that concern them, still getting surprises and often experiencing the unintended consequences that would have been avoidable if they'd been properly consulted. In turn, we've seen, certainly in Australia, some policy reversals and program failures that have resulted from that. And this in turn has had political ramifications, as opinion poll after opinion poll suggests that the public's trust in government is at an all-time low. And as I said, this is happening despite broad acceptance that the tenets of open government are a very positive thing and indeed something that would build trust in the community. And also despite the fact that we've had advances in communication technology that enable a broader and deeper information exchanges than ever before in our history. Well, does any of this really matter? Well, obviously we think it does, and the polls suggest that citizens agree. The backbound paper that hopefully you've all had a chance to read by Professor John Wanner outlines the positives of increasing transparency and engagement with citizens in terms of more effective policy making and program delivery, but also outlines some of the risks as perceived by government, including potentially less room to move, a greater risk of exposure. Of course, the rest of us would see that and both of those as good things, but also perhaps the divulgence of material that could potentially compromise policy development in terms of being able to look at all the options and the potential consequences. And this raises the question of how open our societies need government to be, and that we need to understand what the trade-offs are involved in different dimensions of that, in getting the right balance, including the privacy rights of individuals. Well, this conference, as in other conferences, will look at all sides of these questions, both from an Australian perspective and also from a New Zealand perspective, and indeed with international participants giving their perspectives as well. And in particular, which I think is one of the special features of ANZSOG conferences, we'll articulate what all this means for public servants and public sector managers, the people in this room. And you'll get that from the speakers, but you'll also get it from each other in the conversations that you'll have and in the discussions that you'll have with speakers throughout the next couple of days. So day one, today, the theme is the value of transparency and citizen engagement, just to remind us all what it's all about, both in principle and practice, and what scope there is to enhance it. And day two, we'll look at harnessing technology as an enabler, something to improve transparency and the outcomes that derive from it. Now, Peter Shergold, former head of Prime Minister in Cabinet in Canberra, is quite fond of quoting the science fiction writer William Gibson's remark that the future is already with us, it's just not evenly distributed yet. So I guess part of the function of the conference is to learn from each other, learn from different jurisdictions, to learn from across the Tasman about what is happening and how to spread it most effectively. We're fortunate again at ANZSOG to have attracted a stellar lineup of people from government, business and academia to share their insights with us and to engage with you on these issues. And we've allowed, hopefully, enough time for that in all the sessions that we've got here. That combination, I think, embodies what ANZSOG stands for, which is relevance and rigour in all that it does and all that it offers, and probably distinguishes its contribution to member governments in both Australia and New Zealand. I'd like to thank in advance all those who will be appearing up here in front of you today, but all of you who've have chosen to attend, who obviously understand the value of such events, both in terms of enhancing your own knowledge, but also enhancing your networks of professional peers and collaborators to help you do your job better in the future. Well, these events can't really work without sponsors, and we've been very lucky in having a number of sponsors stay with us through the years, and I'd like in particular to thank our principal conference sponsor, the Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand. Well, they're all up there. Cisco, our technology partner, Urbis, a lanyard sponsor, dinner sponsor, very important, Telstra tonight, and of course KPMG, who sponsored last night's event, the Patterson Oration and the welcome reception. Well, last year's conference introduced the innovation of inviting leading political figures to set the scene for us. ANZSOG's got government in its title. It's not just about the public service. And as we found last year, having senior political figures open our conference and the discussions helps to keep it real, and that was certainly the case with Bill English and Joe Hockey last year. This year we're very fortunate to have the Honourable Paula Bennett, Minister for Local Government, Social Housing and State Services in New Zealand, and also Associate Finance Minister. With Bill English, I was talking to Paula a bit earlier, they clearly collaborate, they're a team in addressing the issues that influence things that matter to the public service and things that matter to the public sector's contribution to citizens. Well, you have a biography in the pack, and it provides a good account of the Minister's achievements. Rather than repeat that, and I hope Paula won't mind, if I share with you one that I found on the New Zealand Nationals website. So it's also an official biography, but I think it complements the other ones. And here it goes. Paula lives in Watakikiri, West Auckland, and has lived in the City of Sales since 1992. She grew up in Taupo. Paula raised her daughter single-handedly. She worked in hospitality, secretarial and retail roles. Realising her opportunities were limited without an education, she went to Massey University as an adult student. Although she originally studied social work, she ended up with a degree in social policy. Paula has worked in human resources and recruitment with a variety of clients across various industries, from banking and finance to manufacturing. Her rapid promotion saw her managing an Auckland human resources company before resigning to pursue a career in politics. Her mantra is self-belief with a dose of hard work can make anything possible. Paula became a national member of Parliament in September 2005 after 3 years in opposition as a list MP. The public of Watakiri, her Westies, chose her as their electorate MP and representative in Wellington. Paula is passionate about ensuring a brighter future for all New Zealanders, and as the Minister for Social Development, she believes she's been given a great opportunity to effect positive change in people's lives, the lives of their families and their communities." End quote. In the biography that you have in your pack, it also notes that she is now ranked number 5 in Cabinet. Now, some I've spoken to in New Zealand, Paula, rank you effectively number 3, and some have even said you may be a potential number 1. So we're very fortunate to be able to welcome Paula Bennett to address us at the beginning of our conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ina mana, ina reo, e te iwi, e te motu, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's great to be here. Welcome to your conference and everything that you're going to do. To the presenters that are going to be here, to all of the officials from both Australia and New Zealand, academics, those practitioners, I'm sure there's a few in the audience, they always are. I quite liked ANZSOG's kind of their ultimate purpose is to achieve better outcomes for society by enhancing the public sector's capacity for good public policy and effective administration. And it certainly occurs to me, and it certainly, I'm going to walk away and see if it works. Oh, it does, I love that. It certainly occurs to me that we've got something to learn from each other. You know, from New Zealand to Australia, New Zealand for our size and our nimbleness and our simple structures of government, I think, give us the opportunity to try something new. And then Australia, simply with your might and your scale and your size, and what complements that. The two of us together, I think, with the interests of our citizens foremost in our mind, gives us a real opportunity to learn from each other, to share good ideas. And so these sort of opportunities, Gary, to come together and do that is something that we certainly celebrate. As it's been said, I was the Minister of Social Development within New Zealand, so I'm responsible for all social services superannuation. I'm about 1/3 of our government's budget for over 6 years. I was the longest serving welfare minister ever. There's probably a reason for that. And it was a job that I absolutely loved. And so at the last election, it was probably time for a change. And the Prime Minister said, so, you know, what's kind of next? And I said, structure. If we're really going to make significant difference in people's lives. So with the combination of state services, local government, and then with the finance role, I'm having an all-of-government look at how we, the public service, and I do mean me as well, are here to serve the public. And the structures that we've set up around that and the use of data and how we use it. You know, are we really servicing the public for their good? Or have we set up structures in such a way that it suits us as government, but actually is not reflective at all on the types of lives that people are living now, let alone what that's going to look like in sort of 3 to 5 years' time. So that's what I thought I would have a bit of a chat about. It was quite amusing. I was at the airport yesterday on my way out here and I saw a senior New Zealand official who's probably in the room. And she said, oh, what are you going to talk about? And I said, I'm going to talk about data analytics and the execution of that within our communities. And she goes, oh yeah, that really is your thing. So let's talk about what my thing really means when we get down to it. I mean, data is still locked inside, for me, the sort of servicing silos. We talk about silos a lot. But it's even more important than just looking at it of the structure of the vote or the agency. It is that data is all sitting there, yet how we actually apply that in real people's lives in real streets and real communities is still locked inside that kind of servicing silo and not being shared as broadly as I think it really needs to be. I mean, I personally feel a huge weight of responsibility. I stand up and try and get re-elected every few years. I'm in an incredibly privileged position to be able to instigate change and to work, you know, for the better of the people whom I think I'm here to serve. And I genuinely feel that responsibility. And I know that officials do too. I know that certainly in the policy work that you're doing and thinking about how you administer that and administer the kinds of services that people need, you feel that weight of responsibility. So it is really about our ability to sort of get it to the place where it needs to be. I mean, we know so much. We know so much about people's lives, but we have yet to work out how to use that knowledge and how to use that information. And I kind of say there were plenty of data, but no real information on what's happening on the ground, what's happening with people's lives, and whether or not that kind of spend is making a difference. Now, I am going to talk this morning probably mainly on social services. One reason being that it's my background, so it's kind of what I know most. But the other reason being, for us in New Zealand, it's 2/3 of our spend. Yeah, so it is the significant part of our fiscal spend. And if we don't change the way that we are delivering services constantly, with citizens and their needs foremost in our mind, then that spend and that fiscal challenge is only going to continue to increase. So it really gets down for me about what the data actually tells us, the analytics, who to share it with and how. I think the public need to give us permission to use data. And anonymised data is pretty easy. So being able to go and say there's this amount of children in this area with these kind of characteristics, and that's all good. And that can influence our policy decisions and our spend at a national level. But it then gets down to how you use individualised data if you're to get into and target the right kind of children and the right families. And I think that's a challenge that we haven't already got over. I'm spending most of my time at the moment, I've probably spent the last 4 years with my head in data analytics. I'm passionate now about the execution of it. Because with all respect, a whole lot of wonderful pointy heads can sit around for a very long time pontificating on what data and how you merge it and what it actually means. And I get that because I can get well merged in it myself and get totally turned on and just see that it's the way forward. But that's all good and well unless we're then administering that, I think, to the execution of what you use it for, how you use it for analysis, and how you really fast fail and then build up what needs to be continued and scaled up. So back to so a piece of work that I was particularly, and I thought I can only really give you experiences and tell you some of what we've kind of learned from it. But the white paper on children has been interesting in the respect that we've got a terrible rate of child abuse in New Zealand for some of our most vulnerable, a small but significant, too big for a country as beautiful and wonderful and full of opportunity as ours. And I would hasten to be so rude as to say that it extends here in Australia as well. It is really to both our countries' shame that there are children that are quite frankly being killed and seriously hurt in homes throughout both our countries that just simply should not be. They should not be for who we are, for the level of maturity we have, for the kinds of opportunities. So how we tackle that differently. And I knew that to change significantly how we worked with those most vulnerable, and I'd done a whole lot of predictive modelling, so we'd really looked at who it was, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that. It got to a point where within about 18 months, 2 years of being in the job, some of the data analysts, and one that I got that I worked particularly close with, he'd gone through 200,000 case files of children that were abused and neglected back from the mid-90s, to the point with our predictive modelling that we can literally, pick a number, tell you the 1,000 children aged between 6 and 9 that are most likely to end up in jail and or be seriously hurt or killed. And it gets you to that point where you're not sleeping at night and literally feel ill as to, so what do you do with it? And this is what I mean. It's one thing to actually have the data and the information. It's then that execution and that sense of responsibility as to what you do with it. So what I worked out was what we needed was permission to use it. That it is the public's, and actually all of New Zealand was in on it. I recognised that when I stood up and gave speeches on child abuse, it usually was stony silent, and there was never a question at the end. A quarter of them would cry, and then others would tell me that it was the most depressing speech they'd ever heard in their lives. I'd give a speech on welfare, and I tell you, it would be every component of, opinion and who's right and who's wrong, and everyone seems to be able to judge everyone else's lives really easily and really well, and have the one thing you can and should do that will absolutely stop those beneficiaries from all of the rampant behaviour they're up to, which was dreadful. But anyway, I couldn't get with the child abuse how you would actually get that conversation going. So we wrote the white paper on children, and with that white paper, we canvassed a whole lot of ideas, and we certainly had predictive modelling. And then that's fine, but here it gets down to, and I did read John's paper, and I was like, so how did we get that we actually then generated interest and had genuine consultation in a subject that is so taboo, and a subject that makes you feel physically ill. And for those that don't live in that kind of life, we find it hard to believe it's even happening because it's so outside of our realm of possibility. And for those that are living in it, they are in such chaos and dysfunction that their ability to participate in any kind of process is zero. So I decided I had to use my political power, my profile, if you like. So I literally led 32 meetings myself throughout the country. I did it in January when media were quiet and they're desperate to look for something to actually talk about. So I purposely did that on the 10th of January when everyone said, well, everyone's on holiday and everything else. You sort of flipped it up and you went, but the other side of it is the papers are desperate to put something in. So I can generate media and I can generate interest. We had a caravan that went from one end of the country to the other and literally went into towns and talked to people and handed out postcards. We did use of social media like had never been done before on that kind of white paper, on that sort of canvassing of ideas. And we got literally thousands and thousands of submissions in the end, and from a wide variety of people. And we went to middle New Zealand, who kind of turned up, and I literally said to them, are you prepared for me to take money off you to spend on these kids? And it was really, really really interesting. And then the other big part of it was, are you prepared for us to actually do key indicators that then give risk factors to children that then actually determines our spend in certain areas and the level of support that New Zealanders will get? And it was really funny. It was like, yep, absolutely. And I would say, you may not like that we have all this information, but we do. We know who's lived in a state house, when you know who generations ago were at the interests of child protection services. We know who's been on welfare for generations. We know who's at the attention of the police last week, and has protection orders. We know a lot of information about people. And we hold that data in our silos, and we now have the infrastructure that Colin can talk to you better about tomorrow of how we pull that together. So we have a whole new IDI system that overlays across all of our ministries and can pull that together. And ministers are, and then we decide what the key indicators are of where we're seeing failure and what we can do. And that's all good and well. That's what I say. That's all there. We've been working on it for years. It's complex, and I hope you're all still grappling with it. But I figure smarter people than me are going to do that. People like you. It's all about the execution. It means nothing if you haven't got permission to use it. And as soon as you stuff up, it's all over. Yeah, and you saw it in the UK. They did a new child protection service, and they did it through and who could get access to that information. And they didn't do it well. And that work will now be, I would hasten to guess, 10 years until they actually get to a place where they can do it again. So when I say that it has to be careful and thought out, it really has to be carefully thought out, and you do need your citizens to understand what it means. And so they need a value proposition. So you're appealing to a combination of hearts and heads. as to how you get them involved in caring for the wider population about a group that they genuinely don't see, and who, and for most of them, live in pretty good lives, dealing with what they do in every day of going to work and raising their own kids and worrying about whether the school's quite good enough and traffic's a bloody problem and why don't we? And good on them, they have a right, and I just love that they live those kind of lives. But if we care about the others, we have to bring them with us as to how we get there. I had a policy that explaining is winning. And talk about open and transparent government. You know, explaining is winning, and we do explaining as losing, and that is actually false. And we don't give the public enough credit that they do care about the issues of society in general. We think it's all one sentence, and if it can't be tapped out in 144 characteristics, then they're not interested. Well, that's actually not true. But you have to engage them in a way that they believe that it is part of an agreement that they're all in this a bit together. And then you can add to the costs, and then you can kind of get your different groups and how you bring them. But I think explaining is winning, and I think it's a cop-out to say that the public are not interested and to say that you can't engage them. You have not tried hard enough, in my opinion. And we make this mistake as well, many times. It was really funny with the predictive modelling. So I'd say to these people, so what would you do if you knew? What do you want me to do? And they had no idea. And predictive modelling was really interesting. And at the risk of TMI, of too much information for you, you know, I even found it myself, it was quite interesting. So it was like, of course you should share information on our most vulnerable children. If you know that there's a history of abuse of the parents themselves, and that you've got a custodial parent, and that these things, of course you should share information. And then what you do with that gets really interesting. And then one day I made the fatal mistake of sitting down there and going through all the key indicators, and went 17-year-old me with no father on a benefit, living in pretty dismal conditions, going from one crisis to another, probably would have been in that box. And would I have liked my information shared? Would I have liked to have thought that social services were looking at me and sharing information with health and education and police and others? Quite frankly, it still makes me feel kind of squeamish. So it's all good when it's about someone else. It's kind of different when it's about you and your family and your kids, and you don't trust the government. And they're the ones that hold the information and all of the power. And so, and the day you don't give that due respect is the day this goes public and blows up, and it's all over as far as the permission you'll get to move ahead, in my view. So, let me keep moving. So this is a bit about the welfare valuation. And I know some of you would have heard a bit about it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. But this is ultimately where we took everyone that was on welfare. We got Taylor Fry, Australian organisation. We sat there and did the actuarial approach. And I tell you why I did it. Because having been a solo mum on benefit, got in, finally got the big job, which was kind of cool, I've got to say. And then went, I know what we've got to do. These women don't have confidence, they don't believe in themselves, and they just need to be backed, and they need more help with their CVs. They need to be asked what they want to do. We just need to spend a bit more money earlier, and most of them will get off benefit because they don't want to be there. They just don't know how. And for most of them, they've lived lives where they're told they're pretty much rubbish. And so we as the government have a responsibility to get in there and change that as early as possible, set expectations and do it right. So I just need a bit more money and I'm off. And Treasury went, yeah, right, love. Not quite like that, but it pretty much was, you know, another minister to see off. Oh, wait this one out. Jesus, she's loud. And so they, you know, and they did. They don't admit it to my face, but they so did. And so, and the Minister of Finance, he literally did, and he did say it to my face, you know. And so I was just like, they were like, we've spent thousands and hundreds of millions more, over the last count of years, and we've actually seen an increase in the number on benefit. We're seeing intergenerational independence at its highest, more babies being born to women on welfare, and we're not changing. So if it was all about the money, things would have changed by now. I was like, right, so I have to prove it. And so that's why we did the valuation, because ultimately what it did was it put the numbers alongside of, gave a level of openness and transparency that we'd never seen before. So it's important as much for that. You can see where you're failing, you can see where you're spending, and it's easy. So we took all of those people that are currently on benefit, all of the characteristics of what we knew about them as a cohort. We then measured that over their lifetime and came up with a big number. The big number mattered because it got attention, but actually then what mattered was that underneath of that you sat your macro, micro, and then right down to the individual. So we literally could look at the micro as far as cohorts. We could then break that up however we wanted, whether that was by region or putting in different characteristics. We can then break it up by, and then right down to the individual, where it will get to a point, and it's kind of there, but we're working in different groups as we go, where someone comes through the door and we go, tap, 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 your own parents were on welfare for 50 years, you've lived in a state house for all of your life, you're at the tension of social services, and your risk factor for staying on welfare for a very long time is really high. Cost to the country on average for a sole parent is $278,000. It's worth us spending $30,000 in the next 8 months to see if we can turn that round. And that's literally where it kind of gets to. The first valuation was 78 billion, the next 69. So that's what I mean. You see real results as to what you're doing and whether it's working. And as I say, you can really break it down into the micro and almost to the individual if you really want to. That matters, and I think what's important there is 3.8% of that drop was due to welfare reforms. So that's the kind of detail we can get into. So others, just because of CPIs and different factors, but we can literally go 3.8% of that 11 was due to welfare reforms. It's working, it's doing its thing. And we are expecting more reductions, and we're well on track for it. So the whole idea of it is that, that other bit of that slide didn't come up. So let me tell you that where it gets really interesting is what we did with youth services. So every bit of, and this is where your data comes in. So obviously the earlier you go on welfare, the longer you're going to stay there, the higher the cost, you think. But then we could literally break it down to where. So we just went, so Bill English and I actually just went, why don't we make it simple? We don't want them going on welfare. So that's our outcome. Yeah, that's our outcome. So once we went out there with that outcome, we decided that no longer could the government put kids on welfare. So we just said no. They had to go to, so we contracted with community youth organisations. We set up a whole new system for them. We then, what we did was for those kids that are NEET, you're not engaged in education, so we got our NEET kids. We literally gave them a risk factor from very high through to low. We then put a monetary amount next to that risk factor because we didn't want those youth services all skewing to the easier kids, and we wanted to pay more for the more difficult. We then told them exactly what the outcomes were that we expected, and we told both the youth service and we told the kids themselves. We reward the kids for the kind of behaviours we want. So once they've done 6 months in education, we give them an extra $10 a week. Once they've completed a budgeting course for 6 months, we give them an extra $10 a week. We then no longer give them cash. We pay their rent directly. We put a small amount, no more than $50, onto a plastic card that they can go and spend, right? Then with the youth services themselves, we pay them administration fee, and we then pay them based on the milestones that they achieve, and over a fairly long period of time. So it's not just about them not going on benefit, it's them staying off and us making sure that we reward the behaviours that we want as we go. So that's been running, I think I set it up 4 years ago, so it was, actually it was less than that, it's 2012. So we're 3 years in now. We have a 21% reduction in the number of young people going on welfare at the age of 19. 21%. Staggering. absolutely staggering. A couple of things we haven't done which we should have, which is always the challenge of learning. So we collected really good data on who and that sort of thing. What we didn't collect good information on, and we're now doing, is on what exactly the more successful organisations are doing. Yeah, so we just didn't collect that data as we would have liked to have. You've always got to be in a learning mode. But you can see the kind of differences. I can rave about this stuff forever, but we have the lowest number of sole parents on welfare that we've had since 1988. And we've accomplished that in 3 years. And we did that by the data analytics, working out exactly whom we're going to work with. We then did individualise the data, so we didn't have to anomalise it because we were doing it within work and income. So we then literally went to a work and income. We went, here's 300 women, all with similar characteristics. 100 of them we're going to contract out, 100 of them we're going to do more intensive case management within side, and 100 of them we're not going to do anything. We then would analyse that at the 12-week mark, because literally it's 12 weeks to get someone off welfare and into meaningful work. We would then evaluate the success or not and scale up what did and stop what didn't. And it's just about that easy. BPS, so this is our Better Public Services that Bill English would have talked a lot about. So we have 10 of them. It's changed the face of how social services, about how government works. So it's beyond social services, but this really, and I'm responsible for all 10 now in an overview. So, literally, as we say, 38,000 fewer people on a benefit. That's 42,000 kids. No longer growing up in a welfare-dependent home, by the way. We're doing really well on our Better Public Services. Really interesting, though, now. We're now getting to the really hard, gnarly end of it. So the only way we'll get more people off benefit, the only way we'll get certainly the early childhood NCEA and the crime is by the cross-agency work. So what I'm working on at the moment is, do we make it part of a chief executive's performance appraisal that they have to demonstrably show that they have worked towards a BPS target that's not their responsibility? Yeah, how do we get departments to literally buy in, not just with their words, but with their actions and how they do it? So now the responsibility is to take that welfare evaluation and that welfare investment approach and to build it out across the whole social sector. And so this is what I'm working on at the moment. So between us, we've now worked out whom. So we're going for that most vulnerable 15% of the population. We've then worked out with the whole IDI, which is our integrated data. Someone here will know better than me. So with the whole IDI, which is where the data all sits. So we've then now agreed on our key indicators. So our key indicators are for children, so we're going 0 to 5 or 12 to 24, and we go long-term benefit receipt. We go has been at the attention of Child Protection Services, has had a custodial parent, and the mother has no education qualifications. And so any two of those get you to around 5 or 6% of any population. So to give you an indication, in a small city in New Zealand, there are 19,500 young people aged 0 to 17. 477 of them have all three of a custodial parent at some stage, have been at the attention of Child Protection Services, and have been more than 3/4 of their life on welfare. So you got that? 470, ugh. So then we get to what we do with it. Better have a look at my notes. So I have a few bottom lines. So the bottom line is anything we do has to be positive. So because let's get, like as I say, we spend so much time, and that you get why you spend so much time, because that's fascinating, that you can break it down to 19,500 to 477. But unless we change fundamentally how we work and how you do, and what I'm calling adaptive contracting, so unless you start working on adaptive contracting, it's all good and well in this room, and it means diddly squat in our communities and for those kids that we're actually talking about. So if you're not spending as much time on execution as you are on the data and the data analytics and the how you're sharing, then I think we're doing a disservice to those kids that need us desperately. Because let's not pretend that those 477 kids have a bright future. They have a dreadful future ahead of them. So unless we're getting into execution, we are not doing them the kind of service we need. And so execution, for me, and this is where our debate is at the moment, has to be place-based. So for me, it has to be place-based. And then I've got heaps of examples that I don't have time to go into on how we've tested place-based, and you all will too. So why hasn't it worked to the extent that it needs to? And with all respect, it's because of the politicians and the senior bureaucrats. Because we want to keep control, because we're scared of failure, because we don't know how to manage risk, and when it really comes down to it, we have not handed over mandate, and we have not handed over the real money. And so until you set up a way of accountability that gets over that, and that's where data analytics gets really, really exciting, because you can use that to overcome your fears of mandate and accountability and risk with public money. You can genuinely use it. So when you get those 477 kids, when we turn around and we literally look at taking a percentage of funding off health, education, housing and justice, for example, and social welfare should be up there as well. So when you look at taking actual money off them, because otherwise you're just doing business as usual plus, and that's rubbish, because all that does is continue the programs that are not working and just adds another one in, right? So then how do you make sure that, so if you get it, you know that there are X children in X place with X characteristics that have got these kind of likely outcomes. Data analytics all gives you the indicators of how you will measure success. Stop telling people what to do, because you don't know. With all respect, you do not know. I don't know. And I'm probably closer to it than a lot of you. So stop telling them what to do, tell them what you want. And be very clear about how data will drive the kind of how you will measure success or not. And then give them all the flexibility in the world. So I'm looking at joint venture boards with real mandate, with real money behind it, with a percentage of budgets in it, that then measure success so they know exactly which children, and this is where it gets down to that individualised, so can we give them those kids' names? I haven't worked that one out yet. I have to keep moving, I'm talking too much. This is Bill English's slide, he loves it, so I just had to use it. And I tell you why this is significant, because, you know, that man, quite frankly, is a genius, and he's someone that I just have the biggest respect and admiration for. He went out there and did what I thought was an extraordinary budget, not that I'm biased at all, and then went round to 44, he gave this speech 44 times in 3 weeks. And most of his slides were all on the GDP and where this is heading and what the spend and how that does. And this is what he chose to show the country. So this is how serious we are about transparency in our next stage of work. So did you get that first bit? Oh, I better talk you through it. 1% of 5-year-olds are known to child youth and families supported by benefits, and so this is just cutting it a slightly different way but the same. This 1% is around 600 children. The point is that over a 20-year, it's your pipeline of 12,000. So if we look at an average group of 10 of those 5-year-olds, a group of 10 of these high-risk children, here you go, so they are high risk, 7 will not achieve education qualifications, 4 will have been on a benefit long time, so that's 40% for crying out loud, and a quarter will have gone to prison. So each child in this group will cost taxpayers a minimum of $320,000, and of course some of them are our $1 million kids. Now that, as I keep saying to Bill, is fascinating and gets everyone's attention. Now we spend as much time on executing a response to those kids as we have in actually pulling that information together. These are some of our challenges that are pretty straightforward, and I think I've already gone through them as I've talked so much. And it is that anonymised data versus cohort versus individualised that is still a challenge for us all. And this is because I'm the Associate Minister of Tourism. This is Queenstown. of which I have looked up for you. You'll all be pleased to know, those of you from Melbourne, you can leave at 9 o'clock on Friday morning at the small price of $350. You can go and visit the most beautiful place in the world for a mere 3.5 hour flight. I can have you back by 5 o'clock on Sunday, which I think is pretty impressive, so that you can start work again on Monday morning. You can come summer, you can come winter, you'll have different experiences. But this is our little jewel in the crown, and how can I not finish on showing you that?
And Paula's kindly agreed to be interrogated a bit frost-like by me, and then we'll have a couple of questions depending on how we go for time. I guess the first question, when I look at all that you've done, and a lot of it's in the really sensitive area of social welfare, right? And I think about, the history of reform, or so-called reform in Australia in those areas. It's absolutely fraught. There's almost a sort of conventional wisdom in Australia these days that a really reforming government doesn't get re-elected. Well, you did. You got re-elected. How do you describe it? I mean, to what do you attribute the fact that the Nationals got back? You got back with a bigger majority than you had before, and yet you achieved quite a lot as reflected in the kind of numbers, including taking things away from people. Well, that's how it be perceived. What are your thoughts about that?
I think one of it is that constant positive, and I know people will argue, and you can Google my name and you'll hear all sorts of horrible things about me. But at the end of the day, I always believed that our interventions were positive, and it was never about spending less. So it might have been in the very long term, but actually, in my first budget, I'm going to have to try and remember now, but I think I got like $180 million more from the Minister of Finance, on top of the welfare spend that was going up and up and up. So I could genuinely point and say, I'm spending more money, if that's what, your measure of is. So once you took that kind of out of the argument, and it was, and I call it positive intervention, but as I say, people wouldn't have all seen it like that. So I started insisting that women look for work when their youngest child was, I started it when the youngest child was 6, it's now gone to 5. I mean, I remember being just months in my job, literally 2 or 3 months, and I went to an OECD thing, and I was sitting there with 20 other ministers, and we were talking about youth employment, and I remember the GFC, and that was that 2009. And beginning of 2009, I just remember sitting there and them saying, so tell us about your welfare, and I went, well, you go on, and we pay them literally hundreds of dollars a week, and then, if you're a teen mum, it'll be the first time you've ever got that sort of money, and then we don't check up on them, we don't know what they spend it on, we don't know, they can have another baby while they're on benefit. When they're 18, we might then insist that they go and look for work, or we'll just move them to another benefit. And that was embarrassing. So we were just so non-interventionist that actually we needed to become interventionists at one stage, set clear expectations. So I would say that we are incremental reformers. Not that I like titles too much. But
would you say radical incremental reformers?
Well, if you look back on it, it is. We've fundamentally changed the whole welfare system. One of the things we did, which was quite remarkable, and the public don't care, but we discovered, I introduced an MCA, which is a multi-class appropriation. So I took the power of politics out of the decisions of welfare. Because too often politicians go, oh, public cares about youth, spend more on youth, spend more on youth. And yet that might not be what the valuation and what the data is telling you is the most risky area. Actually, what most of the data tells you is that it's those with low-level mental illness. Tells us that we've got 50,000 people with back pain and obesity issues in our welfare system that needn't be there if we had a different health response to them earlier. So that's what it tells you, and it tells you where to spend. So the MCA took that, and I was told I was the first minister ever to give themselves less power. But with the use of data that we've got now, it needs it. So we absolutely have reformed the whole welfare system. Not only did we get voted back in, but I ended up being the longest welfare minister at this stage ever. And in any of its permutations, how we sort of went. And we did that by bringing the public with us by doing enough of the kind of we will not put up with while we drove a truck through fundamental system changes.
One of the things that struck me when the key government first came in was not only the good intentions about all that, but the willingness to set up some explicit objectives, about 10 of those, and then to measure performance against those in quite a transparent way. That's kind of revolutionary when you think about it, a government willing to sort of hitch its colours to the mast and then have a process of evaluation. We have a form of that in Australia through the Review of Government Services, and when I was at the Productivity Commission we used to produce these things, but they're great door stoppers. And when I had a look at your website, you distill it down into quite accessible performance measures as to whether you're doing better. How do you handle it when people perceive that you're not doing as well as you might have against those kind of indicators?
We just own it. Domestic violence would be one, where we've certainly seen our crime rates drop considerably. There's areas to genuinely be proud of. And then there's domestic violence, which, if anything, is certainly as bad, but if not increased. So, and we're 7 years in. We're a third-term government. Everyone's kind of looking at us and going, when will they? They're going to shake and break, kind of stuff. But so let's now own that hasn't gone as well as it could have. We've got a Minister of Justice that's literally today put out a whole document on the controversies and what should be done, and put some ideas out there, and has started that discussion yet again, has got all the experts involved. We use the Productivity Commission, as you know, to test ideas. We're not scared. We sort of fail fast becomes a bit of a catchphrase, which is the wrong one to use. But I kept saying youth services was a classic, so a few months in, tell me what's working well, tell me what's not. And they'd say, well, this isn't, but you can't change that. And I'm like, well, why not? And they said, well, because you'll be embarrassed. You're going to have to stand up and say you got that bit right, and you can't do that. And I went, too right, I can. We've done massive change. I'd rather be tweaking as we go rather than getting years into something when you can't go back and change it because you have put so much political capital into it. So change as you go. Don't be scared to stand up and say, we've got this bit, but we still haven't done this one. And as I say, we don't give the public credit enough. They know it's complex. They know it's incredibly hard. They don't think there's one piece of law we can write that will fix the terrible destruction of domestic violence in our countries. So they get the complexities. They just want to know that you do and that you're not scared to test things and keep going. So I would just say own it when it's not going as well. Don't be as arrogant to believe that you do have all the answers, and be ready to change.
I once saw an interview on Australia with a woman who was running focus groups for both sides of politics, actually, and she said she tried an experiment, and at the end of the discussion about some area of policy, you'd ask the focus group, do you expect the government now to do what you said? And the answer astonished them, because they said, no, they're the government, we're just telling you what we think. So getting those responses, I think taking risk and being courageous, but actually explaining, obviously, is something the public does respond to. The thing that, again, that distinguishes New Zealand, I think, from Australia is the amount of information you make available that comes out of political deliberation or bureaucratic deliberation. So your cabinet papers, other bureaucratic papers are made available. I'd like you just to comment on that. I mean, some would say that that drives the real discussion underground, or means less of it gets put on paper. And that's a bit of a concern. We're going to have a session in our conference on FOI, and that's one of the concerns people have, and we'll hear a little bit about that. I'd be interested in your perspectives on that.
So that's definitely driven by Bill English and the Prime Minister in the very early days. So the Prime Minister was just kind of, we are an open government, we have to get more open, we have to be more transparent, and then Bill English executes that. So, and it was definitely the right thing to do, because they gave a lot of us no choice, which is kind of sometimes a good place to be in. There was no debate on whether or not we would be putting all budget cabinet papers. We put them all out, I think 3 weeks, someone here will know, 3 weeks after budget day. The whole lot I just put out there for consumption. And so we do it in the belief that it will be released. Someone did say to me earlier in the day that the Clark government more set the agenda with speeches and that we do it more with cabinet papers. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I found that quite interesting. That so we tell a story often, and it's our way of also getting our story told. So I tell you though, changing culture is very hard. And read that and I was thinking, so I still walk through my office at least once a week saying to my own staff, our starting point is yes. Our starting point is yes. And because they're risk averse and they're trying to protect me, and they, and you can't just do it once and think you've done it. You literally have to do it every week, because our the natural state is to pull back in. So then, does it change the advice that you get? Does it change the conversations that you have? In the early days, and particularly even in opposition and that sort of thing, you get bitten a few times. So you have conversations like this, and some would think that I'm far too loose in talking to you like this with cameras around. And so you got to the stage where you would just kind of, you would just have dreadful stories where a sentence was either taken out of context, and you've read all about your politicians in that kind of place. So one is fighting back at it a bit. Mm-hmm. One is knowing that within a day that's going to be gone, and actually I'm doing enough good work that I can perhaps take that a little. Because if you just get so nervous to debate the issues, to actually really get into the heart of it, to get the kind of advice that you may not always agree with, and that at times can be controversial, you're doing it, then that seems that it's all about you and not about whom you're here to work for. Mm. It's doing a disservice, quite frankly, to the public, and that's about you as an individual. So grow up, suck it up occasionally, because you're going to get bad press, and that's life. Never ever blame your officials, is my personal belief. So even when they have made the mistake, you stand up and you take it yourself, because you want them to take risks.
A lot of people agree with that in here. That's right.
Because you all have a tendency to climb back in that shell and want that head out there and going for it. So I always say to my wonderful people, I just sort of say, I can only prove it to you by my actions. So you be brave, because the country needs you to be brave. The country needs you all to be sitting here and debating the big, complex, gnarly issues of the day. And if you're so worried about what the headline will be tomorrow, then you're not brave enough. So I think we as politicians need to know how to take the odd hit, but as long as it's for the right reason.
Well, just on that, and the relationship between ministers and departments and department heads and so on, I mean, another point of difference, obviously, between our two countries is the appointment of heads of department. And my good friend Ian Rennie is seen as the head, who's the Public Service Commissioner over there, is seen, or State Services Commissioner is seen as the head of the Public Service. Which is
How do you do it here?
Which is not true here. So the head of Premier's or Prime Minister's department would be seen as the head of the public service, but more than that, CEOs can be appointed at a political level, whereas in New Zealand they're appointed by Ian, no doubt in consultation with ministers and so on. How's that working?
Oh, yeah, but it's an independent appointment. So him and I, work really closely and all of that sort of thing. But I have immense respect for the public service being, apolitical and an independent of ministers and political influence as such. It makes sense that, people are going to work well together and that they've got a level of capability in things, and that they understand your work program and it's something that they can work towards. But I can honestly say that's the only sort of consideration that we give. And I think it's vital. We've certainly got a number of CEs who we would consider to be our top performers, who have been appointed by previous oppositional parties to us, and so it just within their term of government, and that's just a non-consideration, quite frankly. I don't know, if you're all focused on what you're trying to do and less about yourself and that sort of thing, then outward looking and not inward, then you can accomplish great things. So I think that independence is vital, personally. I mean, well, it works for us. I can't say what works for others, but it certainly works for us in a country so small. Gosh, if we did fire half our CEs when we left, you'd have no one else to employ.
You also
not very big. It would just be like
you also tend to appoint foreigners too, you know,
Oh, we
people
do.
from England and even Australia.
I was going to
you know,
say
Australians. Look, my last question before I invite others to ask a couple of questions relates to social media, because you mentioned it. And we heard from Anne Sherry last night that in her current role with Carnival Australia, the cruise ship operator and so on, she had a couple of nasty incidents on boats. You might have read about those and how she went about handling that. And she used social media in a very proactive way, right? Now, I think again in Australia there's a bit of a debate about whether social media has actually become the enemy of reform or made it too hard and difficult. I'd be interested in your views about how to use social media in a sort of positive way and get on the front foot with it. Were there any tricks that you can tell us about?
I mean, social media is important, I think, now, and my views change on it all the time, I've got to be honest, because it seems to change all the time and I can't keep up. So as a mother, I worry about it, but that's another whole subject. But then on the other, I worry, from a sort of public policy perspective, it's important because, quite frankly, the media read it. Because I personally think it's a whole lot of nutters talking to each other most of the time. You know, like really, you know, and I know that's not true, but it feels a bit like it, the bit I see, and I probably don't see it deep enough. So then it's who's your audience of whom you're trying to get to. I personally think particularly things like Twitter go beyond the audience of who's actually reading your tweets. Because if I did that, I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, because I'm the worst thing that's ever happened to the world, you know. Because it's a small group of people, I reckon, that are literally kind of dominating in certain areas. So if your audience is wider than that and you're using social media to get to the more mainstream media, then I think that's clever, and I imagine that's what they did with that kind of incident. And we sort of try to do that. You can shut something down by very quickly responding to misinformation, or them taking 5 words out of something I've said today and stringing them together in a way that's not true within context. So you can respond really nicely and quickly to that. MSD and certainly I got them, they used social media while I was their minister, and I think that was really important. Then again, we had the horrific shooting and killing of 2 of our public servants while I was the minister, which would be the worst thing that's ever happened to me professionally. And we almost had to ban social media, which we didn't. But you know, if you read that, then it was awful. You know, that was the awful side of it. So I don't know. I just think it's constantly changing. Be careful. You can change a story. You can put another perspective out there. It is picked up from mainstream media, but I think it's also got to be kept in context as well.
Good. We've got time for 2 questions. So I'm sure, actually, Paula's been so good you may not have any questions. You know,
I've talked
she's probably,
so much, I'm so sorry.
There's a gentleman in the back row. If you wouldn't mind saying who you are, where you're from, and keeping the question brief.
Roland H. from the Law Commission in New Zealand. Thank you, Minister, first of all, for what I thought was an authentic presentation. I appreciated it. My question is, you started seeking a social licence to use data, and you finished with executing responses. Somewhere in there's a balance between issues of privacy and independence. How did you go about balancing some of those issues?
So that's an ongoing, as you would know, so you know, just ongoing. In some respects, because it's all about learning lessons. So in some respects, one of the play-spaces we tried to set up with the children's teams, which is a very intensive group of professionals that are working with our most vulnerable, they shared less information when we put them together formally. So they had been sharing information beforehand, police, social workers, health professionals, and others. And once we put a formal structure around them, they went, oh, we're not completely sure what we were doing was completely within the bounds of, and so that actually stopped it, which was quite interesting, so that's interesting in itself. That's where I say your execution is so important. We in New Zealand have, and you're going to remember we have an ANZSOG, which is the Information Sharing Agreement. There you go. So it's an information sharing agreement between government departments, which we use a lot, and then we're just extending the first one out to non-government organisations that's sharing the information internally. One is permission from people themselves. I don't know. I mean, you tell me. So it gets to a point where you know your 477 children. Should their parents know that you see them as high risk and that you're going to spend more money on them? I mean, those are the sorts of things that we need to be debating. You know, the ethics of it, the information sharing, as you well know, we're better than we were. We haven't conquered it completely. I see the Minister, bless her, just went out yesterday and said we're being too precious about what can and can't be shared. The law is being interpreted incorrectly and everyone's too risk averse.
One more question. Yes, over in the left over there.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm Tanya Aitamurta from Stanford University, and thanks a lot for the great talk. I have a question about managing change, because as we know, and as you mentioned many times in your talk, change is one of the key factors of open government and opening up government. So what are your advice about how can we manage that change the best way?
So change in general, do you mean, or change in... Can you just put a little more context around your question? Sorry. Just want to understand
change in the sense of technology. There are new technologies that we are adopting all the time in governments. For instance, for opening up data, using crowdsourcing and other methods. Change of the culture. Culture comes always before technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's just got to be constant, I think. So leadership matters, you all know that. So it matters with what you're doing, the messages you're sending to your staff. As I indicated before, I think it has to be absolutely, treated with the respect that it needs to, because they're real people's lives and it's real information about them. But equally, you can't be so risk averse that you're paralysed by fear and unable to do anything and instigate change. As leaders, and you must all be fairly senior to be here, you have a responsibility to be owning it and doing it and backing the people that are actually executing it, because they'll only be as brave as we are in standing up. So, I mean, I know it sounds contradictory, but explaining is winning, so I talk about it all of the time. There's a reason. I did see her in the crowd. There's a reason she went, oh, this is your thing, because I talk about it all of the time. Yet the public won't see it and they won't consider it's radical reform, because at the end of the day we'll also just get on and do it quietly and in different areas, but never without explaining and talking about it. It's just perhaps I talk so much no one takes notice of what I say.
Talking's good, and that's what this whole conference is about, and I think you'll agree that we've had a wonderful beginning with Paula Bennett this morning. There's a New Zealand expression, free and frank, I think, that is the substitute for our frank and fearless, and I think we've seen a free and frank presentation from the New Zealand Minister today. So please, could you join me in thanking Paula Bennett for a wonderful presentation.
Lovely, thank you very much. Thank you.